to be here today. I've actually just come back from judging D&AD New Blood, and it was just, wow, like our industry is definitely in safe hands with the next generation. So, understanding social injustice and that wealth is inherited. So I know it sounds like quite a heavy subject. It is. But my job, I don't know if you know where I come from. So I'm the worldwide head of culture and inclusion at M&C Saatchi. I've been in the role about 15, 16 months now. And I feel that my purpose is just to make the inaccessible accessible. So this sounds very heavy, and in some ways it is, but I'm just going to try and make it more digestible for all of you, okay? So, I don't know if any of you are familiar with a few of the photos that I'm going to share with you, but this is Ellis Island. And Ellis Island was the first kind of port that people would come to before entering the Americas. And Ellis Island, you would be inspected, so they would inspect you to see if you were fit to come into the US. And the point of this talk is to actually just, for us to kind of discover with each other, as I imagine most of you are aware of, that things haven't changed all that much, and history repeats itself in many ways. And it's worth me mentioning, if the inspectors felt like you weren't fit to enter, you'd be sent back. So obviously we're very familiar with the current political situation that we have, which is about walls and, we've got offshore detention camps, and how we're able to justify these things because we actually dehumanize people. And I absolutely adore this quote because I think this really captures the essence of this particular talk, which is the presence of the past in the present. So, borders, why do we create them? I speak a lot about this idea that, if you think about our industry, it's essentially just a microcosm for society in many ways. So the same barriers that we place on people gaining access into industry are actually not so dissimilar to the same barriers that we have in regards to people gaining access into our country. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have immigration policies, we absolutely should, because I always think of our country as like being our home. We wouldn't just open our doors to anyone, there would be a level of vetting. But I just want us to think about this as a concept. So, it is pretty simple. I know this sounds pretty basic, but diversity really is a choice and inclusion is a choice. And the reason that our industry isn't as diverse as it ought to be, and I talk about diversity in every single sense, so I'd like you to also think about whiteness as being a diverse ethnicity as well, which we don't tend to think of whiteness as being an ethnicity, but how is the Polish experience different to the English experience, different to the Irish experience, different to the Italian experience? And obviously all the other characteristics that we have as well. So I think one of the reasons why we don't have as much diversity within our industry is this idea of dispossession. And just to break it down for you really simply, dispossession is simply, if I let someone in, will they take what I have, really, just to kind of boil it down. And I think a lot of people are quite fearful of this. And I think in some ways I completely get it. But I like to think quite abundantly. And I think when we live in one of the richest parts of the world, we have the ability to think quite abundantly. So going back to different characteristics. This really, really annoys me, but people love to conflate the social with the economic. And I'm just going to unpack that for you a little bit. So, obviously, we live in the UK, and I imagine some of you in this audience might know that one of the only unprotected characteristics in this country is class. You can legally discriminate against someone based on their class in the UK. And I think that's just so telling because it really, really explains why we have such a classist, society, because there isn't really any vernacular to discuss it, like nothing's actually been written into policy. So just to unpack the social and the economic. So for me, I think it's quite easy, not easy, but many are able to gain economic growth, right? They're able to acquire money, but would they actually be given access from a social standpoint? So for me, social is really different. Social is knowing how many buttons that, when you have 3 buttons over 2 buttons, what does that mean on your cuff? It means knowing how to use silverware. It means knowing how to read a wine list. It means where you've gone on holiday. And I think with all the money that one might get, I think in the UK, if you don't know this stuff, you're never ever going to be given access, regardless of how much money you have. That's my opinion, at least. And I think we see that with, obviously, some wonderful literature that's been, put out there, like, the demonization of the working class, etc. So, yeah. Oh, I'm definitely pointing in the wrong direction. So, I've had quite an interesting career, or lots of different careers, should I say. And one of my careers was when I was acting, and I was living in the US trying to make it as an actress. Anyway, I digress slightly. I was given this book by this polyamorous poet that I was dating at the time, very New York. And it's Citizen, an American Lyric by Claudia Rankine. And Claudia Rankine is a Jamaican poet that's lived in the US for about 25, 30 years. And she's got a quote which really, really spoke to me, not because it was my lived experience, but it made me have greater empathy for those where it is their lived experience. So, I feel most coloured when I'm thrown against a sharp white background. Now, everything that I'm going to present today, you can take it, you can move it from characteristic to characteristic. So, I feel most female when I'm in a room full of men. You can see it like that. And it really got me thinking about what it's like, say, if you come from a really strong Asian community or black community, and for the first time you're placed in an industry where you don't really see yourself represented, and what that kind of does. So therefore, there needs to be different type of support put in place. And I have to say, I'm really pleased with what we have at M&C Saatchi. We've got 5 different employee-led networks, and one of the networks caters for race, another caters for mental health and well-being, and there's a few others as well. So, how do we create space for difference? What does this look and sound like? I just want to check the time. Okay, so number 1, there is no such thing as a meritocracy. So, meritocracy is a total myth, in my opinion. We gain access into spaces based on our able-bodiedness. I've got friends with disabilities, and I can tell you the challenges that they face, when there's a lift not working at a train station. It just completely ruins their whole day, their whole plans. So we get into places, gain access into places based on our able-bodiedness. It could be our maleness, it could be our whiteness, it could be all these different things. And I think it's really, really important to understand that, but once we know this, it's about us actually empowering and creating space for different types of people that wouldn't ordinarily have access. So, absolutely, as I just mentioned, it's about being self-reflective, it's about acknowledging our privileges, and we're all privileged in so many different ways. I think the very fact that we're all in here today means that we all have privilege. But it's how do we use that privilege to really give other people a voice and opportunity. I think this illustrates this point perfectly. So, above is equality, get my words out, and below is equity. And there's a real distinction here. So, you've got equality, and equality is like everyone has got a set of wheels, right? And then you've got equity is where we actually have to modify things, modify, the bicycle for different types of people. And so that's the distinction for those of you that weren't familiar. So, now, Some of you might be familiar with this concept, reparation. So going back to my first slide, with everything that I've just said, wealth is inherited. Well, that's why we've got terms like the landed classes. So when there are people that haven't been given access to buying rights, what does this mean? Because they can't actually pass that wealth on. And I just think it's something, there's a lot of conversation about this in various different countries around the world. And I just think it's something to think about, because I think it gets people's backs up a lot, because people feel like they're having something taken away from them, or they feel like my family didn't directly cause slavery or, such and such. But what I'm trying to say is, it's about how we've also all benefited in some sort of way. And I include myself in that as well. So, wealth is inherited, wealth is tied to the land. Who gets access to the land? What do they look like? What do they sound like? A friend of mine, she's half Malaysian, or part Malaysian, her mother's Malaysian, and her dad is white British. And when her parents got together, her mum's an architect, when her parents got together, must have been the 70s, because she's a few years older than me, they wanted to buy in one of the boroughs within London, and they weren't able to because her mum, who's Malaysian, wasn't British born. So I think that's something to, that's something to kind of think about. Not everyone has access to land rights. Things have obviously changed since. But when you also look at how different boroughs have kind of been constructed, where different, demographics would be, pushed into certain areas, like Brixton used to be an Irish community, then it became a Jamaican community, for instance. I just think it's quite interesting. And, South Africa is such an interesting one, and I don't know if any of you know much about South Africa, but I think it's like just below 8% of the population is white Africans, and they own 70% of the actual land in South Africa. And, there's lots of debates regarding what Mandela was able to do, and I'm not here to critique him in any way. Obviously, he's done incredible work. But from South African friends of mine, many will say that actually Mandela was great for the black elite, but actually the black poor, and also the white poor as well in South Africa, they haven't really been able to benefit as much. So, I'm doing a postgrad in post-colonial culture and global policy, and I do really feel that in many ways we have to go this far back. We have to go into colonisation to understand the systemic injustices that we have, not just in this country, but actually globally. But what I will say is, I've lived in lots of different parts of the world, and I think Britain is really unique and beautiful. And something that I really worry about is that I think we're importing far too much of an American rhetoric regarding race. And I've referenced, Claudia Rankine, who is a Jamaican poet that lives in the US. But I think that's something that we as a society need to be really careful that we don't adopt. Because I think the way that people relate to each other is very different. America was a settler colony. So when slavery was happening there, it was literally on people's doorsteps. People could see it. Where in the UK, slavery happened in the colonies. It was completely out of sight and out of consciousness of the British public within the UK. So there's a real distinction, and I think it's really important that we continue to make that distinction between the US and the UK. So the reason I bring up colonisation, even though I'm talking about these distinctions, is that for us to understand the Industrial Revolution, that was funded by colonisation. And obviously the Industrial Revolution has created capitalism, consumerism, our industry, and therefore globalisation. So there's a chain. There's always a chain. Something I also speak about a lot is person versus system. You know, there's a lot of language that people use which really, really annoys me a lot regarding calling people disadvantaged because they haven't been able to get into industry or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. People aren't disadvantaged. The system has them at a disadvantage. And that's a real distinction that we need to make. A few more minutes, okay, cool. All right, so I've got 10 more slides. I'm going to speed through really quickly. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Dr. Georgia Guri's work, but she's fantastic. So she talks about when you've got a prejudice and you've got power, that instantly becomes an ism. And I think anyone that is in a position of power, such as all of us in this room, we're all in a position of power because we all have privilege. That means that we need to be really, really careful when we have biases and prejudices. Okay, so number 2, listen, a willingness to understand. This is just about listening to people, and I think we just need to start engaging with people that are completely different to us. You know, homework that I give to people when I, you know, do some unconscious bias coaching is speak to someone that you've never spoken to before. Like a lot of people within their organisations have never actually spoken to the support staff, being the reception team, the operations team. They don't know their names. So really push yourself out of your comfort zone. Speak to someone you've never spoken to before. Obviously, we're in the industry of storytelling, sharing. That is what produces empathy. And thirdly, it's compassion, empathy, patience. You know, it takes time to kind of fight social injustice and to really just see another perspective on the world. It's about humanity. And through that humanity, it's about us identifying common ground so we can actually just get on, and that cultivates a sense of belonging for everyone. So be courageous, be brave, and we must not merely change the narratives of our histories, but transform our sense of what it means to live. It's interconnectivity, and final quote is, my liberation as a man is tied to your liberation as a woman. And I love this. I think it kind of sums everything up. We're all in it together. Thank you very much.